And I think that we have a very great panel here for, I think, the most vital conversation to be had about Pakistan's economic future right now. Before getting into some of the opening questions, I just wanted to acknowledge, I understand that this is an all-male panel, and I think that I understand Javed tried very hard to have a more diverse panel, but I want to acknowledge that that is something that we have overlooked, given the fact that female labor force participation is one of the most vital issues that Pakistan's economy faces, and it would have been nicer in the future. But before that, it's the reason why economic growth is an incredibly important area for Pakistan. Labor force participation in the region, only beating Afghanistan, the fact that economic growth still remains at or below population growth of almost 3% every year, and the fact that energy prices have tripled in 3 years, that taxation has gone up significantly, that purchasing power has halved and poverty has increased, mean that this is an incredibly vital conversation to be had for the future of this country. And I wanted to start with Ali Khizer to kind of level set for us, what is the challenge going forward with economic stabilization, given that Pakistan is also facing an IMF straitjacket?
Thank you, Humza. It's a very interesting question. As you said, that we've gone through a very difficult, rough period of time in 22, 23, and the Governor State Bank is sitting there, and he's been instrumental about creating the stability. What we are seeing that, but the challenge we now have, we are entering into a 4th year of stability, and still we are in search of growth. So the question is that how long we can live in this stable environment without really going up to high growth model. How can we employ the youth? How can we increase the productivity? How can we generate employment? So these are the tough questions we're going to ask about in this panel, and this whole the dialogue which is going to happen for the 1.5 days. So we need to introspect what's going on and what went wrong. So Pakistan traditional model, which being economic model, which we've been following for the past 30 years, 40 years, it's somehow it's been strangulated. It's not. We are constrained to not operate on that. So how did we attain the growth in the past few spurts? That based on the government development spending, that based on the concessional financing provided by the State Bank, and through the monetary policy, where the real interest rates are either negative or had remained negative, or they were close to zero, right? So then there was on the agriculture side, we were giving you the wheat support price, and there are other areas where we saw the growth was coming up in that. Now what's happening today is that because of the fiscal constraints, the development spending, especially from the federal side, is extremely limited, and even the provinces do not have that much space to spend. So that angle where you get to have the growth from the development side is not coming. The private sector, where from the 1960s, from the model of the DFIs, we came up with and from the banking privatization and deregulation. And after that, the concession financing was the mainstay of exports growth. And we've seen that when the interest rate were lower, and effectively, in 2002 to 2004-5, we effectively had a rate of 2% in the market. And then in 2013 to 2017, we have effective rate of 6 to 7% in the market. So those were the days when we seen growth on that. Plus, there were so many other concession financing over there. So with IMF recent conditions, there is no concession financing available now, and the real rates are positive as well. And one element which I missed is about which we've seen in the past 20-25 years, where we channelize the domestic household boost is through real estate. So everybody was invested into the real estate. And when the real estate value were going up, even the profits were realized or not realized, the wealth effect was fueling consumption. That is not happening anymore. That's not happening anymore for the taxation of whatever reasons. And we all agree that that's not the right model. Now, living today, when we are running primary fiscal surpluses, We ran primary fiscal surplus 24, 25, expected to be in 26 and 27. And then we are having a real positive interest rate. Right now, the interest rate, the policy rate is 11%, and inflation on the forward basis, as SBP expects, is about 7%, 6 to 7% or something. So we are running a positive rate of 4%, and we had our fiscal surpluses, a primary surplus of 2%. How can we have growth when we strangulate the economy through that? And then when the private sector is not getting the concession financing and the cost of doing business is going up, I mean, because of the fiscal constraints and because of the growing debt, we somehow managed to, dodge the default, but dodge the external debt default, but our domestic debt has doubled in the last 3 years. In terms of GDP, it fell in the previous year because of the inflation was high in 23, 24. Inflation was high, so that to GDP was falling. Now, because of the prudent policy of the state bank and the fiscal side, the inflation has came down.
But just to jump in here real quick on the point of, because I think that was a really great level set of how we got here. And I think one thing that I also want to just jump on that and ask is, given that we've come to this place, what are the different perhaps theories of economic growth that Pakistan can take forward and the policy measures? And I asked Dr. Cheema to step in here because you've done great research on how countries like Pakistan can move towards growth.
Thanks. So I think sort of growth is perhaps the most misunderstood thing in Pakistan. And I think we need to step back and think what is the real nature of our economic crisis. I think we're facing two very endemic problems. One is structurally, we have been growing very slowly. And that slowdown in growth is not recent. It doesn't date back to the crisis, the macro stabilization crisis that started in 2019. We became laggards in terms of growth about 3 decades ago. So if you look at Pakistan and you compare it to its peer competitors, around 1990, Pakistan's growth started to diverge from its peer competitors. I'll just give you some statistics. If we had grown at the level of our peer competitors, Pakistan's GDP per capita would have been 44% higher today. If we had grown in those 3 decades at the rate of Bangladesh, our GDP per capita would have been 100% higher. So we really have been in an endemic, low growth, structural equilibrium for 3 decades, which is very different post-partition when Pakistan was actually a leader in growth till around 1970. So structurally, we really have to figure out where things went wrong. Now, how do we create growth in Pakistan? I think that's the second thing which Ali was talking about. And the way we create growth is we pump prime consumption. And how do we pump prime consumption? We run high fiscal deficits. Those fiscal deficits basically create surges of demand in the form of consumption. That translates into an import demand which is growing at a time when our exports are very uncompetitive. So we face what is called a structural external account problem, which is the boom and bust cycle. So we're doing two things. Our supply side is slowing down over the last 3 decades, and our ability to pump prime and create growth is actually leading us to repeated crises in terms of the external account. Now, how is this problem squared? And this is where we come to policy. The problem is squared by 3 things. You borrow externally, so you create sovereign debt. And what is that sovereign debt doing? It's actually allowing you to plug that gap between the high import demand and the external account crashing. And that gives you more time to create that consumption-led growth. And the second thing that you do is you rely on remittances. Pakistan has one of the highest remittances to export ratios in the world. Now, why does growth not happen? This is the classic point. Reza is sitting here, Ishrat, Dr. Shamshad. Economists think about 2 or 3 drivers of growth. One is investment, one is human capital, and basically the third is productivity. And in all those indicators, Pakistan does really badly. So our investment rates, as you mentioned, are really low. Our basically human capital formation is actually one of the lowest in the region. And in terms of productivity, again, Pakistan was a huge success story of productivity till the mid-80s. And then productivity started to crash, right? So what are the fundamental drivers of growth are basically not moving. And the question that I think this audience, the captains of industry and policy that are sitting here, need to ask is really what should be the growth model. And I'm basically going to stick my neck out and say we don't have a growth model. We have a model to keep the external account in balance because we chase external finances. And there is a really nice study, and I'm going to end with this, which recently came out by Atif Mia and Abhijit Banerjee, where they're looking at the relationship between sovereign debt borrowing and investment. You would expect, because this is a moment where we're celebrating sovereign debt borrowing, there's a negative correlation between sovereign debt borrowing and investment. And I'll give you the exact figure. A 1 percentage point increase in sovereign debt borrowing results in a 3 percentage point decline in investment. So what sovereign debt does is it actually crowds out basically domestic investment. And if our history is anything to go by, remittances fuel consumption, they don't fuel investment. And that, I think, is a big thing, that how do we take the structure, and I think the government has done a great job in stabilization. This was an extremely hard stabilization. I had a seat on the table on the State Bank Board, so I also saw how difficult it was. It was very difficult for the economy. It was very difficult for the citizens of Pakistan. But what has this stabilization done? It has given us a moment. Now the question is, how are we going to use the moment? Are we just going to buy money to buy us time? Or are we going to use this time to really dig deep and think, how do we start moving the needle on investments and exports? That's the question.
And I think that was a fantastic overview of how we got here and the challenge we face. And we're lucky to have two people who've had some of the most difficult jobs dealing with this crisis in the last few years, Dr. Shamshad and Dr. Baqir. And I wanted to ask the two of you, if you were in government, if you were back in government today, what are the policy levers you would pull to try and push Pakistan onto that growth track? To start with Dr. Shamshad, then to Dr. Baqir.
Okay, I'm uninvited to this platform, so but I'd like to thank BBC for getting me out here, at least informing that this was taking place. I think I had the privilege of working in Pakistan as Governor of State Bank during very difficult times, and transformation of the central bank is not an easy job, but we managed to do so. And subsequent efforts have resulted in giving us a very healthy banking system, and it's functioning and it's competitive. So I think we need to celebrate that. Second time I entered into Pakistan from overseas was when Pakistan was going through some serious crisis, and I was appointed as interim finance minister. And if you recall, we were on the verge of default in Pakistan. My first job was to actually develop a homegrown agenda that would be stabilization, pro-stabilization, but at the same time would rejuvenate growth and bring in substantive, innovative elements that could live beyond the term of the interim government. And I try to bring this trajectory a little bit, is that Pakistan can be transformed if we were able to stabilize the country within 6 months and also sow the seeds of some innovative products. I'll just give you a very small product name, Sukuk, Islamic finance. And it resulted in promotion of Islamic finance. And today we are planning to move towards the Islamic financial system, economy and financial system. I have to give my tributes to Cheema Saab, because he and I have interfaced at different times, and his analysis doesn't require any further elaboration from my side at all. I have to say today, from the platform that I'm sitting, which is as the chairperson of the Pakistan Stock Exchange, of course we benefit from stabilization programs. Every time there's a fund program, everybody celebrates in the stock market. However, in my view, it's very unfortunate that we continue to indulge in external borrowing. Why do I say that? This is a deterrent to us because we do not allow the domestic resource mobilization to nurture in this economy. Today, our tax GDP ratio has barely moved from 9.8 to 10.3. During the interim government, tried to overhaul the whole FBR system, but it goes back. You take one step forward, it goes back. We don't enhance the policy base, we just keep on raising the rates, and we have 60% dependence on value-added tax. So indirect taxes are killer to the public as well as to the businesses.
And just on that point on tax,
yes,
because I just wanted to also get to Dr. Baqir very quickly on which policy measure that he would kind of pull if he was back in government today. And if you had a specific policy measure that you would have pulled if you were in government today to try and get us on that track, what that would look like.
Thank you, Humza. First of all, I just want to thank PBC for this great event, and I'm honored to be with so many distinguished speakers, and want to also recognize the State Bank Governor, Jamil Saab as well, who I had the pleasure of working with. I also just want to say it's very good to see good familiar faces in the business community. I have fond memories when we worked together during a very tough time in COVID days. You know, Pakistan then was facing difficult challenges and really appreciated the collaboration and partnerships that we had. मुझा आपका ये सवाल था कि अगर आज कोई फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर हो तो आप उनको क्या सलाह देना चाहेंगे? And I think it's a tough question because you know, one has to strike a right balance. मैं जो पहले कहना चाहता हूँ वो तो ये है कि you know, we should not take for granted कि जो stability आई है, how difficult that is. All right, and you know, Dr. Ishrat, first of all, is here, who presided over a very prosperous time with stability. Dr. Shamshad. I think we should just take a moment to appreciate the work done by the economic team, led by the finance minister, state bank governor. और दो तीन चीज़ें जो इसमें हुई हैं, मसलन अगर आप अपना tax to GDP ratio देखें, right? Historically, it was at 10. I remember when I had just joined the state bank, we were negotiating an IMF program. I remember the tax to GDP ratio then was around 10% of GDP. And I think for the past several years was 10. And I was just looking at the IMF report, the most recent published one, and they were projecting it to be above 12% for the fiscal year that, and then I haven't seen the latest numbers that came out, but there has been improvement in the tax to GDP ratio. It's not easy. Dusra, I want to appreciate the efforts of the state bank, and you know, our state bank governor is here. You know, having stabilized the exchange rate is not easy. Aapko yaad hoga pehle, before he came, it was in a free fall. And if you look at, you know, the real exchange rate before that free fall and after that free fall is roughly the same. But managing to stabilize it is not easy. So I think usko karna while to increase reserves is not easy. We should really take a moment to appreciate, because managing the domestic process, managing your external stakeholders is not easy. People on the outside often take it for granted, so we should, number one, appreciate that. Ab dekhin, now the issue becomes growth, and you know, we've had these debates before, we've had excellent diagnosis as well. Pehle to hame ye sochna chahiye ki who is going to be responsible for a growth strategy that is also consistent with stability. हमारी तारीख में ये हमेशा होता है कि usually if you have sort of people who are leading on the stability side, finance minister, central bank governor, the two most important posts, everything tends to come to them. कि जी आप ये भी करें, ये भी करें, ये भी करें. So the first thing we have to figure out is who is going to lead on the agenda on growth, and then who is held accountable for that. Do we want, say, the finance minister and the central bank governor primarily to be responsible for economic stability? Or do we want to add a lot of mandates to them, which at times can be conflicting as well, right? Now, in many countries, the planning ministry plays a key role in that regard, while fully being consistent with stability or some other part of the government. So we have to first figure out who is leading on that front, because typically in most governments that we've had, there are many people who seem to be leading on that front, and a clear growth strategy, jaise ki Cheema saab keh rahe the, we have to define who is responsible for that. I'm not recommending from myself, but there needs to be somebody who can do that. Now, uske elements kya hone chahiye? It is not rocket science with regards to what Dr. Cheema very nicely reminded us. We need a rise in our investment to GDP ratio. We do need a attention to exports. Mein aage aapne kya karna hai? I just want to then stop by saying ke, what would you do differently? Ek to ye hai ke I think don't declare victory too soon. All right. I go back often and I think that in 2019, when that period of stabilization started, and there was a good run over 2 years, 2019, 2020, 2021. But then in the middle of 2021, in the summer of 2021, what happened? Many people went to the then Prime Minister and they said, "Ke ji, बहुत austerity हो गई है, लोगों को सांस नहीं आ रहा, थोड़े से कोई नलके खोलें, कोई give some relief to the common man," the same old narratives that we've heard many times. And then what happened? जो 2% of GDP fiscal consolidation हुई थी over that period, over the previous 2 years, was reversed in 1 year subsequently. And then the consequence of that was very clear in terms of the balance of payment crisis that we have. So we'll talk a little bit more, I think, as we get going. What do we want to do? I'm a big, I've been thinking a lot about the role for industrial policy as well that many other countries are pursuing. We'll come to that. But if there's one thing I want to say is, let's not declare victory too soon. Those people who are right now responsible for stability, let us not undermine them by saying कि जी बहुत सख्ती हो गई है और अब आप नलके खोलें. Thank you.
And I think that's a great segue to get, I guess, a bit more meaty policy discussion. I want to go to Dr. Ishrat in a second, which is that, the reason I ask which policy lever we might pull is that Pakistan faces a panoply of challenges that all feed into growth. There's a moment that says, should we pursue industrial policy, have more government in the economy? Should we have less and let creative destruction play its course? Should there be a debt renegotiation to give more room for a subsidy to fuel spending on health and education? Or should we keep a straitjacket, reduce the government presence, let the rupee devalue and just spur exports that way? And so there's so many different challenges and policy levers that different governments might take in Pakistan, given just the series of crises that it faces. And just to come to Dr. Ishrat, I know you've written extensively lately about industrial policy and whether we should be thinking that something that has been a dirty word in Pakistan for some time, associated with quote unquote picking losers and not allowing the most efficient industry to emerge, might be something that can be reclaimed right now. And if you could just give us a little bit of context on what is a positive government role in the economy look like to build a more efficient economy as well.
Thank you, Humza. First of all, let me congratulate BBC. I think it has been very successful 20 years. I followed them. And they have emerged as a rational, analytical representation of the private sector and its role in the national economy. So I want to congratulate them for that particular role, rather than a lobbying arm of the private sector for rent-seeking purposes. So I have this very commendable tribute to the leadership and the membership of the, and you should continue to do that, otherwise you will lose your credibility. So that is, for the next 20 years, this is my advice to you. Now, I want to start by looking at the successful examples which have really made a difference as far as sustained growth is concerned over a long period of time. And the three countries which I find are my sort of benchmarks are Japan, Korea, and China. And what do they stand for? They stand for Japan Inc., China Inc., and Korea Inc., Incorporated, where the private sector and the government worked hand in hand in order to achieve the goals and the targets which they set. There was no adversarial or confrontational issues between the government, and this is what is lacking in Pakistan. And I came across, when I was doing my research for the comparison of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, which my book has come out, I found a quotation which I had never seen before from Quaid-e-Azam when he addressed the KCCI in 1948. Except a few, all other industrial activity is left open to private enterprise, which would be given every facility a government can give for the establishment and development of industry. Government will seek to create conditions in which industry and trade may develop and prosper. I think this is a very powerful quote which people have not realized. What we have done, we have created bumps in the road leading to sustained growth, and those bumps have to be removed in order to raise the speed limit from 2 to 3% to 5 to 6%. And what are the bumps? I would not go into all the diagnostics, and Ali Cheema has very rightly pointed out that the growth model, which has been applied across every single developing country, consists of the capital inputs, the labor inputs, which now is more human capital, and what is called residual, which is the total factor productivity, right? In Pakistan, you have a very peculiar situation where the formal economy size is about 350 billion, but if you add the illicit economy, which is coming through all other smuggling, over-invoicing, under-invoicing, all that, and the informal economy, which is outside the tax net, your aggregate size of the economy, which is the aggregate demand, because the size of the economy has to equal on the expenditure side with the aggregate demand, is about 700 billion. While your aggregate supply of agriculture and industry in the real sector has not caught up with the demand. Therefore, the excess demand spills over into imports, and that imports therefore creates the balance of payment crisis, because your industry and agriculture have not caught up with the non-debt creating flows, which is exports, right? So this is the reason why we have a debt GDP ratio which is unmanageable, and $26 billion every year you have to find in order to service your debt. This is the crux of the problem. Non-inflationary and non-debt creating flow is your growth model. And Luis, who was the first person who came with this model, he says this will be a transfer of resources from low productivity agriculture sector to high productivity industrial and services sector. But unfortunately in Pakistan, there has been a transition from the low productivity agriculture, but your urbanization, which is completely haphazard, has created a low productivity atmosphere in the industrial and the services sector. So what is the way out? Number one, you have to look at your industrial and manufacturing sector. I have been visiting, with the help of my friends, industrial units all over Pakistan. And we complain about, very inefficient industrialization, and I'll come to what they should be doing. But your base industrial industries, which are responsible for providing the raw materials and intermediate goods to the downstream industries, are completely absent in it. We don't have a petrochemical complex. We don't have steel. We don't have machine tools. We don't have aluminum. What are we doing? We are raising the cost of the downstream industry. They cannot expand, and if you have economies of scale, their unit cost of production will go down, and that's why not competitive.
But if I might ask just right here, I mean, what can the government do about this
Well,
problem?
I think
What
the
is the
government
step that can be
has to
taken?
get out of the way of the private sector and create an atmosphere in which there are not these savings. Look at we talk about investment. Look at the saving rates. The domestic saving rates today is 8 to 9%. Government disk savings is about 10%. This, if goes down to 3 or 4%, your savings rate will be much higher, and you will be able to have a good investment ratio. Thanks to your remittances, which are about 6 to 7% of GDP, your national savings rate is high. And by the way, I disagree with people who consider remittances an unrequited transfers. They are in the balance of payments. But according to the WTO definition, in the Mode 4, this is an export of manpower services. So you have an extended labor market. Half of your labor is employed domestically, and half of your labor is employed abroad. And they are earning export, they are sending this money as the earnings which they are sending to their families. I agree with Ali Cheema that we have to find some ways in order to harness that remittances from consumption to the investment. That I agree. But those who dismiss remittances as a Dutch disease or unrequited transfers, they are quite wrong, because this is an export of manpower services.
Thank you.
And services are growing much faster than goods. And therefore, we have to think about that.
Thank you very much. And I think Dr. Baqir and Dr. Cheema wanted to jump in here as well on where to go from here on how to design growth.
On your question as to what is then the role of the government in terms of getting growth with stability, एक दो चीज़ें जो मैं कहना चाहता था, and this is going to be slightly different than what Ali Khizer said, and Ali, I have a lot of respect for Ali, I always read his pieces. But for Ali Khizer, I mean for both Alis. I think the first thing I wanted to say, Ali, was that I think getting sustained growth for us, the answer doesn't lie in macroeconomic policy. अभी आप कह रहे थे real interest rates positive हैं, they're not going to let growth come, या हमारा fiscal surplus है, that's tight. I don't honestly think that the way to get sustained growth is through macroeconomic stimulus. I think the right path for especially fiscal policy, because we have a history of fiscal dominance, is to maintain a primary surplus. And I also believe in expansionary fiscal contractions. There's a lot of evidence that in those countries that have a history of fiscal dominance, keeping prudent fiscal policy is actually better for growth, because it gives people the confidence that there's not going to be a balance of payment crisis in the future. Furthermore, I think government spending, if you call it development spending or something else, I don't think really has a very good correlation with raising overall investment in the country. A true test of public investment would be if it crowds in private investment, that it doesn't substitute for private investment. So my suggestion first and foremost would be that we set macroeconomic policy aside. Now when it comes to sustained growth, और इस पे मैं थोड़ा सा और बात करना चाहता था जो इशरत साहब कह रहे थे with regards to the role, तो फिर state का क्या role होना चाहिए? There is one view which is that says कि जी अगर आप हमारी तारीख देखें तो government interventions have generally not been very helpful. People are normally thinking of state-owned enterprises. People are normally thinking of picking the losing sectors, जिनको subsidize किया. There's a lot to be said for that. But I think that at the same time, if you look at what's happening around the world, if you look at the United States, for instance, with the CHIPS Act, I don't know if you've followed what a big stimulus that was for prioritizing manufacturing of semiconductor chips. If you look at China, if you look at EU, they are all right now have very active research agendas into what is the right industrial policy for them, number one. And it's not just a matter of economic growth for them and the way they characterize it, it is also a matter of national security. I was at a conference recently at the Kennedy School on the CHIPS Act. Okay, this is their flagship program for industrial policy. And you know who the guest speaker was? Was Jake Sullivan, their national security advisor. Because for them, that part of industrial policy is keenly tied up with national security. So my view would be first, yes, we do need to think actively. How can the government, the state, have a more proactive role? We do need to think, what does that mean? And I would submit at least three things. One, whoever does this in the government, has to be led by people who have the right private sector background. In the CHIPS Act was done by people that they attracted from private equity firms. They did not have government bureaucrats design the nature of the incentives such that there will be semiconductor plants in the US. It was led by people with the private equity background, number one. Number two, industrial policy does not mean state-owned enterprises. We should get that out of our head. It does not mean state-owned enterprises. It does mean partnering with some of you in this room as to how to support those who have demonstrated that they can compete in the world, not those who are relying on handouts, but those who have demonstrated that they can compete in the world. How can the state support them more? And third, I would say, to avoid the problems of the past, is transparency. CPEC ka abhi tak hame nahi pata, we don't have transparent analysis ki what was good, what was not good. So whatever we do going forward, there has to be a core element of transparency so that there can be more of a national awareness ke directing industrial policy towards certain areas, is that the right way or not? And furthermore, sunlight is the best disinfectant, so it will help us to avoid the mistakes that we have made in the past. But I do believe we have to play a role, including for national security reasons.
Thank you. And just in the interest of time, I do want to maybe make this a more free-flowing conversation.
What Reza was saying, we have to forget the old industrial policy 1.0 model where the government had the old discretionary power to pick the winners and the losers. That is gone. Today's world, the industrial policy 2.0 is you use innovation, you need technology, you need human capital, R&D, level playing field, and let the private sector decide what are the winners and what are the losers. So I just wanted to supplement that we are not going to go back to the government deciding who we should favor. That ends in the lobbying. And look what has happened during the last 30 years, as Ali said, and I demonstrated that in my books, that we were the winner in the whole developing world, and now we are the loser because the government decided that we should become the loser and let everybody become the winner.
And I want to just kind of finish on a kind of free-flowing conversation between everyone, starting with Dr. Cheema, about specifically actually the inclusive aspect of growth. I mean, it's one thing for us to have a high-level economic policy that maybe hits all the right numbers, but at the same time, it's no secret that that we live in a country where not only are there violent disaffection with the state in parts of Balochistan and KPK, few women have access to the formal economy. You have young people in major cities like Karachi and Lahore who are suffocating under major taxation, taking on a giant burden, can barely afford electricity, and are losing faith in their relationship to the Pakistani social contract. So how do we guarantee that this growth also reaches these people, and not just those of us in Islamabad or who look at the high level and maybe don't see that daily life that people live with in rural Pakistan or in middle-class parts of Karachi and Lahore.
So I want to go back to something Reza said, which I think is extremely important. I think we need to stop thinking about this problem through macro policy lens. And I think we need to start thinking really about the micro foundations of growth. And I think that's crucial. The key challenge, and we can debate industrial policy. I've always been a proponent of industrial policy, but I think those are details, is that if you stay with the IMF program, you're going to see a massive fiscal consolidation. Right? That fiscal consolidation, if means that government is actually going to raise resources, and that's just a fact that's going to happen if you're going to carry on with stabilization. So the question is, how will those resources be used? And that takes us back to a core problem, which I think nobody is talking about. It's an elephant in the room, which is Pakistan's public finance challenge. And I think that has two elements. Whenever we talk about public finances, we talk about taxes, and I have something to say on that. But the core of Pakistan's public finance problem is its low growth elasticity of public expenditure. The issue isn't, look, you're all sort of people of business. You borrow to invest. If you borrow to invest, over time, you're betting on the debt going down because you're generating incomes with that investment. This is a country that's been doing that for 78 years. You have 4 governors of the state bank. Each is remembering the crisis that they dealt with. All governors within the century. So that's how many times we've been on the crisis table. But we have been spending a huge amount. We spend about 17% of GDP with about 10% of resources. It's that spend that has not resulted in growth. So the first thing is that we need to really think about where public investment is going to go. And how will that actually align with industrial policy? And in that sense, I disagree a bit with the mantra, get the government out. My slogan would be, get the government to make the right investments. The second thing that is there is that when you talk about inclusive growth, the big challenges that we have in terms of inclusive growth, that the private sector can never resolve, is human capital. You cannot scale human capital without government. It's just, there are 2 big challenges, education and health. I mean, if you look at the stunting figures of this population, which is a young population, that requires investments in water, sanitation, and municipal infrastructure. That simply cannot happen without the government making the right moves. I think the only way to solve that is through economic decentralization. And I'm not saying that because Ahmed Iqbal walked into the room, but I'm a big proponent of economic decentralization. And we forget that we are highly economically centralized. China, local governments in China spend almost 25% of government expenditure. The same is true of the US. One is an authoritarian economy, one is basically a liberalized economy. Both have decentralization. And I think I can talk about it in detail, but unless you start to empower cities and districts to make investments in schooling, in public infrastructure, in sanitation, healthcare, and in terms of dealing with urban flooding, you're not going to have either the climate crisis resolved, nor are you going to get human capital. The last thing I want to say is that we need to start thinking about taxes from the framework of growth, right? I keep hearing this, that all taxes are equal. That's just wrong economics. If you want to promote savings, you don't tax savings, right? If you want to promote investment, you don't tax investment. Everybody knows that you want to tax non-reproducible capital, which is land. We have one of the lowest tax rates on property. I mean, all countries that Dr. Ishrat has talked about have taxes on property in different forms of between 1% to 3% of GDP. You know what our tax rate is? It's 0.05% of GDP. That's how low it is. So if you don't make those fundamental shifts, basically in looking at tax policy through a growth lens, what you're going to have is you're going to have massive fiscal consolidation, by the way, which is not going to affect everybody, because in Pakistan, we have a dual tax system of some people, a very low base paying a very high rate, and then a very big base paying effectively nothing, essentially. That's just unsustainable in terms of growth. So we need to really start to think about the tax lens from a growth framework. And again, I want to end with what Reza said, and he's absolutely right. Please don't underestimate how tough it was to do this stabilization. Where the governor is sitting here, the finance minister is coming later. It's not been easy. So the fact that you've got here allows us to breathe. Remember, 2 years ago, we weren't even breathing, right? But now we have to make really bold choices.
Every dollar you earn from exports and remittances.
Yes, so we have 4 great questions about HDI, trust in the legal system, frictional costs, and the role of regulators. So
I'll start with the regulator. When I was doing these institutional reforms, we had delineated 3 different roles: policy making with the ministries, regulator to be independent of the government as well as the private sector, be a referee, and the third one is the operational, which were the autonomous bodies or the corporations. The difficulty is that unlike the State Bank, which was in consultation with both the businesses as well as the banks, and listened to them and designed their policies and their interventions, which did the best for the businesses as well as for the banks, there is a tension between the regulator and the regulatories in Pakistan, because you have not selected the right persons for the right jobs. The regulators have not been selected on the basis of their competence or on their leadership. These have been based on patron-client relationship. Unless you have that transformation, I think this ambiguity, which you very rightly point out, in other regulations will continue. But the purpose was that the government should have a level playing field with the private operators, and the regulator should make sure that there is no preference for the government as compared to the private sector. The private sector and the government should be on the same level playing field. That was the philosophy. Now, आपके सवाल पे, लेकिन बात यह है कि आपने प्रोमिसेस को पैसे दे दिए. हेल्थ और एजुकेशन का एक्सपेंडिचर जो है वो वही का वही है, प्री एनएफसी अवार्ड एंड पोस्ट एनएफसी अवार्ड. एंड द टीचर्स क्वालिटी आप जाके देखें, वो सेकेंडरी स्कूल के टीचर हैं, सेकेंडरी की स्पेलिंग नहीं आती उनको, बिकॉज यू हैव डिवाइडेड द टीचर्स ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ कोटा. In my own province, there are 2 political parties. वो कहती हैं हमारा कोटा टीचर्स का इतना है और हमारा टीचर्स. अब जाके चेंज हो रहा है कि मेरिट पे हो रहा है. But if you have that kind of quality, why do you want to spend more money? More money will actually destroy this. What you should do is the government will make sure that every child goes to school. But the delivery of the services should be given to the private sector, to the NGOs who have actually done and have private-public partnership. And like the Punjab Education Foundation, you give a stipend for each student. And that, I think, will take. I did a study on Bangladesh. Bangladesh, the government was as corrupt, as inefficient as Pakistan. But the NGOs, BRAC, Sir Fazil Hassan Abid, Allah ne Jannah Nasib Kare, he took over himself. कि विलेज लेवल से लेकर और द डिस्ट्रिक्ट लेवल तक उन्होंने स्कूल्स और क्लिनिक्स जो थे वो प्राइवेट पब्लिक पार्टनरशिप के बनाए. इमारतें बना दी गवर्नमेंट ने, लेकिन चलाते जो थे वो एनजीओस थे. एंड आज देखें वहाँ की लिटरेसी रेट और फीमेल लेबर फोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन. सो आई एम नॉट वेरी एनमर्ड बाय द पीपल से वो 4% GDP कर दो एजुकेशन पर, सारा ठीक हो जाएगा. गवर्नेंस एंड द मैनेजमेंट and the decentralization, and I've been with Ali on this कि जब तक आप decentralize नहीं करेंगे और 2002-2007 में आप देखें कि education, health, water supply, ये facilities जो थी, they were such accessible to the ordinary citizens that the satisfaction rate was 56%, which has never been before devolution or after devolution. That combination of giving the delivery of the services to the non-governmental organizations, but at the same time giving the authority to the district governments or the city governments, that will take your human capital up.
And I think just I want to get some rapid fire answers on some of the last questions, specifically on trust in the legal system. And because I think that's quite an important question, so just if anyone has an answer, very quickly, 30 seconds to a minute.
If I could just share a couple of points. Trust in the legal system is absolutely a key point. The question is, do you have the right people on the stage to address it? And who is that person? If I ask you, does the business community have a go-to person that is accountable for that? I think a good first step would be to define that. But if I can quickly address two other questions.
Very quickly, yes.
First, I just wanted to say on the role of HDI, आपने बिल्कुल ठीक सवाल किया. Ishrat Sahab has given exactly the right answer. The only other thing I wanted to add was because you went towards government spending in these areas. And we have a tendency, to measure outputs by inputs. Government spending is just an input towards a goal. And we have to first see whether actually that in the past has delivered what we think is right or not. And if I think there is far better productivity if you get the private sector to deliver and some of these key indicators. Second, I would say, learn from the different experience of provinces. Hamare mulk mein, without naming, some provinces have done a lot better on improving their HDI indicators as to others, and there are lessons, to be learned. On the role of the regulator, Bajwa Sahab, you have absolutely a very powerful question. Just commenting over recent years, बैंकों के साथ मिलके some things that were done for the financial sector. आपको याद होगा साथ मिलके हमने रोशन डिजिटल अकाउंट बनाए थे, which was something that has strengthened the sector. Other innovations, Rast आया था. These are all things that were not just about squeezing, but they were rather about how do you make the financial sector to grow. A lot more to be done, but yeah. So I was just going to pivot. I was just going to pivot to other areas where this can be. And one area which I feel is extremely important and I think needs more attention is the competition authority as a regulator. Because, we have to figure out, do we have, a level playing field amongst competitors or not? And this partly, I also wanted to go to your question about that you said, Humza, about inclusivity and equitable growth, and you made a very good point about certain sectors that are left out. There is another aspect of inclusive growth, which is कि क्या अभी छोटे सेट और बड़े सेट में level playing field है कि नहीं? क्या अभी जो medium sized players हैं, can they compete in a way that they can become big players or not? And I think there are real challenges over there. We don't pay enough attention. The way to sustain growth, even if you look at the experiences of some of the other countries, their giants today were not necessarily their giants that had been there 20 years ago. And that dynamism of innovation has to come from breaking down the barriers to entry for the middle-sized players to compete. If the bigger players can compete better, that is par for the course. But on the role of the regulator, I think competition authority to me is one thing where we do need to have a lot more dialogue. I'll just end on another point on inclusivity and equity, which is, the lack of equity between those who are in the formal sector and those who are in the informal sector. Everybody here is in the formal sector. You're competing with often people who are in the informal sector. And on taxation, as Dr. Cheema was saying, we also need to think about how is taxation, our tax policy, helping towards that goal? Or is it actually driving more of this inequity between the formal and the informal sector? And we do need to think a little bit about that.
Yeah, I see JK wants to move on, but we could go all day. We're all here throughout the rest of the conference, so any follow-up questions, please come up and ask us.